Hello and welcome to the Drunken Buddha Podcast on trauma, healing and spirituality. My name is Ben Tannehill and I'm a somatic therapist and sort of a spiritual enthusiast. And I wanted in this introductory episode to talk a little bit about what this podcast is, what you might expect to find in it, and a little bit about my own journey traversing the landscape of trauma and spirituality, and sort of a little bit of my own view, I suppose, of the duality between trauma and spirituality, the way they're sort of separate, but the way they actually ultimately converge, and the duality between them dissolves. And really doing trauma work or spiritual work for me is ultimately the same thing in a certain sense. So this podcast is aiming to bring together these two wings, essentially, because you're seeing that for most of the history of spirituality and sort of the human medicine and psychology, which is in being sort of largely intuitive but quite primitive in many ways, obviously until fairly recently, they're quite separate. So you tended to have the spiritual practices of yesteryear were either very based on concentration, so concentration practices, or that's sort of the contraction of attention, of awareness, in order to sort of pierce through reality, pierce through mind, or more expansive awareness-based practices where you'd relax attention and just rest in being. Similarly, it's a way of sort of dissolving, slowly dissolving mind from that end of the stick, as it were, either from the sharp contracted end or the open expansive end. But neither of those paid particular attention to the contents of experience. And there are exceptions of various emotional and energetic practices for sure, but this is sort of the emphasis, particularly on how it's carried down to modern day, Buddhist or non-dual Advaita practices, is much more on the sort of the end of this concentration and expansion rather than the contents of experience, which is where the trauma resides, right? In the contents of our experience, you need to be much more, or there is a way of being much more responsive to the contents of our experience, the trauma, the emotions, the survival responses we're experiencing. That can be very, very useful. So on the one hand, you've had those spiritual developments. On the other, you have, in the last 50 years, this big upsurge in understanding in the physiology of the nervous system and trauma, the human mind, developmental psychology, all of these things, which is teaching us a huge amount about, why we behave the way we do, why our mind is structured and responds the way it does, and also how to go about healing that. So human behavior, we're not just crazy, we're not just weak or lazy. There are powerful survival responses that are forced into play under certain circumstances, with difficult childhoods, abuse, war, all kinds of things which force us to adapt, certain survival adaptations that then become dysfunctional. This is kind of the definition of trauma, is this emotional residue from the past which creates these survival responses which we keep looping and playing out again and again, over time becoming more and more dysfunctional. And to resolve those, we need to come back into the body, feel those emotional residues, let them integrate back into us, so we feel more whole, and that dysfunction can start to balance itself out. And these two sides, the spirituality and the trauma, are increasingly coming together. And with this podcast, I really want to bring together that conversation of trauma and spirituality. What is the difference? What are the similarities? And what's the connection between the two? How have they played out? So we'll be having spiritual teachers covering the spirituality side a little bit more heavily, perhaps. Then hopefully some trauma experts of various stripes, and I'm sure there's many people who sit in the middle and just hearing lots of different perspectives. It could be stories of people's lives, or experts who are honing in on one particular aspect of be it one spiritual practice or tradition or some aspect of trauma, in order to elucidate piece by piece this big puzzle of trauma and spirituality. Now, a little bit about myself. I've sort of been on the spiritual path for about 7 or 8 years now, since I was an alcoholic in my 20s. and I sort of hit the wall, as it were, at 28 and got sober. But all the suffering was still there. Although I'd stopped drinking, the suffering was still there in the body. And I just shifted my addictions to other things, and I was still super anxious. Just the whole body was full of tension. And I got into spirituality because I heard that if you meditate lots, you'll be happy. So I was like, I was really miserable. So, sign me up. What do I do? Just tell me. As many people come into spirituality because of the suffering. And I started meditating, getting into non-duality, started chasing enlightenment, all that stuff. And it helped to a certain degree. But I couldn't help the sense that I was sort of banging my head on a wall. And it wasn't until I discovered the somatic work, the body-based work, the trauma work, that things started coming together. So I started doing, the living inquiries, originally created by Scott Killerby, doing some of those sessions, which is sort of, this body-based investigation. And I started crying in one of my sessions. And I hadn't cried in years. And it was just this massive relief. Something that was frozen and stuck had now started flowing. And that, I could just feel the rightness of that. It's like, something just relaxed. And I immediately knew this is what I wanted to explore and go into. So I started doing more training, getting into the work more myself, just doing a lot of work, diving into the trauma, the emotions, holding space for all these parts of me. And in that process, I started finally finding, I don't know, this is some incense smoke. I don't know if you can see this on the camera. You won't be able to hear it on the audio. I've got some incense smoke blowing in front of the camera. Finally started getting the relief, I guess, that was promised. And really now I found the dovetail of the two, like the trauma and somatic work on the one hand, with the spiritual non-dual understanding and ego understanding on the other, to be incredibly powerful. Because the trauma work is really effective at getting to the somatic root of ego, the fear, the anger, the rage, the shame that we're holding in our body. But the flip side is that spirituality gives you a broader understanding of what this process actually is, where it's headed, why it is the way that it is, and gives you a view of life that's bigger than just me, this isolated I who's at the a victim of the world and is just trying to find a bit of peace. Right? You just why can't it be the way I want it? Because you can be in that healing loop for a long time of just trying to niggle away at bits and pieces until you understand that the sort of the I at the center of the whole thing is an illusion, is not as real as it seems. And in this way, trauma really, not to take anything away from how painful it is, trauma in many cases can catalyze and spark a huge amount of personal growth. They call this post-traumatic growth. And this was the case in my own life, right? The intensity and the misery of the alcoholism. At some points I was, just depressed, incredibly nihilistic. I hated life. I hated God. I thought he was an evil bastard for having created this just like absurd carnival of suffering that we just have to drag ourselves through until we die. It just felt like complete insanity. But the depth of that pain was also equal to the motivation I felt when I finally started breaking through and finding, figuring things out. That gave me a lot of motivation to meditate and inquire and learn and grow. And I think a lot of people find that sort of the depth of the trauma is equal to the growth that follows. And in this way, these two aren't really as separate as they first appear. And you can kind of just start to define trauma a little bit more broadly as it's almost any learned conditioning and identity that we have built up around this sense of self, around this I, this ego. So all the images that we have in our mind of who we are, who other people are, what the world is, that we've taken on, is all for reasons of survival. It's all, in a certain sense, false. We've learned it, we've taken it on, we've started projecting this stuff out there. And it's very dissatisfying because it's all false. It's all based on survival. It's all based on these projections and images, which is just, it just tastes like cardboard. Whereas as the traumas start coming and going, you think you're a really angry person, but then you can let go of the anger. You think you're a really shy person, but you let go of the fear that's driving the shyness. You think you're a loser, but then that image, that word, that belief drops away. It's like, well, who am I then really? If I wasn't all these things that I thought I was, this person, who am I? And this is precisely the question of spirituality. Spirituality, in my book, is this becoming directly conscious of who and what I actually am. The difference is that it's not a learned, conditioned image. Ben, somatic therapist, English, 35 years old, all this stuff. It's that direct sense of presence, existence, awareness that's always here. That's the most real thing you can actually find. It's so real, so pervasive, we actually overlook it all the time in favor of these more conditioned, ephemeral, impermanent wisps of imagery and definition and meaning, words. So this is how it comes full circle. As we work through our trauma, we inevitably end up exploring this question of who am I, what am I? And similarly, if you're coming to it from spirituality, you're exploring who am I, what am I? At some point you have to start to engage with the trauma in the body. Because those beliefs about the conditioned, temporary, egoic identity, that's deeply rooted and held on, gripped by the survival physiology of the body. So you can't just see it and let it go, just 1, 2, 3. Like some practices kind of suggest that. Or to see that you're not your thoughts. That can be a helpful pointer in some way, but really, if those thoughts have their root deep in the body into deep fear, for example, you can't just let them go. You have to meet that fear, resolve it. Then the related identity imagery will start to fall away. So in this way, one like yin and yang, one inevitably leads to the other, and vice versa. But exactly how this unfolds is a complex process that's different and unique for everybody. And there's many nuances to it, and there's all kinds of different things that can start to come in. Kundalini and psychedelics and psychology, all kinds of different spiritual practices, the more psychological practices of the West. And even within certain inquiry, somatic-based practices, there are all kinds of different approaches. And I'm hoping to really just elucidate all kinds of different corners of this puzzle in this podcast. So, I hope you'll join me on this adventure, and see you soon.